again. We're going to read Santa and Pete, chapter 4.
I'm over here.
Yes, Addison's still over doing her schoolwork. No amount of persuading or pleading on my part seemed to shake my parents from the notion that this Saturday adventures weren't the best thing since meatloaf and red gravy. Okay. So the next week, there I was, getting on the bus again, trying not to think about how time crawls when you're stuck somewhere you don't want to be. That's when I noticed something that I hadn't picked up before. As passengers waited at the stops, some waved on the bus ahead of us, even though it was going to the same destination. Okay, Addison, please be quiet. Grandfather's bus. Then they flagged him down. And when they got on, a number of them greeted my grandfather by name, gathering on the seats nearest to him, even though there was plenty of room throughout the bus. My grandfather seemed to know their names, too. Mrs. McLeod, Professor DeFries, Mr. Levison, and his granddaughter Rachel. Sometimes they would stay on long past their stop if he started a good story. "Morning, Mr. Man," he said a petite blonde woman with round, rimless spectacles, round glasses, let's put it that way, as she rushed up the steps and deposited her fare. "See if you got your grandson with you again. He's still as handsome as last week." Addison. No, it's not. Mommy's trying to read to the audience. Don't be quiet. Say thank you to Professor DeFries, son. I mumbled a thanks. But she had dashed on to another subject. "Headed back to New Amsterdam today," she asked, smiling. "Feel like making that trek?" he asked. "Well, you know my parents were Dutch, so I always like to hear more about the place," she replied as she sat in first row of forward-facing seats behind my grandfather and diagonally across from me. Then she turned to me and smiled. I noticed one of her front teeth overlapped the other. "Professor DeFries," my grandfather said, calling over his shoulder before pulling back into traffic. "You ever hear of an African bird called Sandcove? I hope I pronounced that right. I probably did." "Can't say that I have, Mr. Man," she replied. "I hadn't either. It's a mythic bird that seems to fly forward while looking back. The point being that if you know where you come from, you have a better sense of where you need to go." "Songfro," she said slowly, as though the word tasted sweet. "Look backward and see where you're headed." At the time, it seemed crazy to me, but I was beginning to realize that people listened to my grandfather. Professor DeFries and the others rode his bus every Saturday, coming aboard and taking the same seats as the week before, leaning in to hear him like children during story hour. And my grandfather delivered. Walking to New Amsterdam might be like walking into your own house and not be recognizing the place. Like somebody took all the furniture out, made the walls stone and the floors dirt. Grandpa didn't use a lot of thees and thous, but his voice sounded different, more formal, as if he might have lived back then himself. His tone transported us, and we were soon looking into the clear eyes of a Lepel Indian woman as she used a sharpened stone to clean the stickiest inside of the beaver pelts before spreading them out to dry in the sun. Then she and her husband gathered the skins to trade with the European sailors who at first only passed through. We heard the almost dead sounding warble of an African slave as he sung to blunt out the pain in his arm, while sawing down 200-foot maple and oak trees so the town could grow. And we imagined the anguished face of a Dutch woman stealing one last glance at Holland as she crowded onto a ship, prepared to live her life in a place that she had never laid eyes on. Through Grandpa, our ancestors come living, breathing people. Grandpa would talk for a while, then get quiet, as he was letting us soak it all in. Those were the eerie moments when I used to think one of his characters might walk right out of the history and onto our bus. So what was this, Grandpa? I asked, looking out the window at the Greenwich Village, where my father often played his saxophone in the neighborhood jazz clubs. This area is near where your African ancestors live, he said, still speaking as if the past were present. Only they call it the Greenwood because of the huge evergreens and all the plants and the grasses that sprouted up near the swamp. How could he see greenery when I see concrete? And how could he see a swamp on a day that was dry as a bone? Grandpa pointed on a stone street, the island's first paved road, and sure enough, cobbler stones rippled out before us. He told us that Pearl Street got its name for the oyster shells people tossed over their shoulders as they ate, takeout from the mouth of the Hudson River. The street called Maiden Lane. Grandpa said that young single women washed their laundry at the end of it, right in the East River, and listened to all the boys' tired up pickup lines. As Grandpa went on, I realized that most casual things, like a street name, could have a wealth of history behind them. Every step I took, someone had walked there before me. Maybe the footsteps belonged to my ancestors, or maybe somebody like Marcus Gravy or Harriet Tubman. Great people. I thought, and if one of my feet touched the same place where one of theirs had once been, I wondered whether I could tap the same power and vision that had made them great. Ain't nobody lived on this island longer than your folks, son, Grandpa said, pulling me out of my daydream. Your family's been here a dozen generations, and considering your Indian roots, how far back could that reach? Maybe a few thousand years? He peeked over at me to see if I was pleased with that information as he was. For some reason I couldn't guess at the time. I sat up straighter. I didn't feel quite as long or emphasis. Yeah. Insignificant. I know that probably don't sound right, does it? Sorry. But what did it all mean? And what did my ancestors' lives have to do with mine? You haven't talked about the part where the Dutch supposedly brought Manhattan for $24 in bees, said Professor DeFries. And you know how the story ends, Ma said. Her favorite seat, when it was available, was directly behind my grandfather, and that's where she sat as she looked at Professor DeFries as if it were Maya's very own land that had been lost. Maybe Maya, with her wide brown face, had descended from the Le Pen, like the woman in Grandpa's tale. The Dutch got a real steal, Maya said, sighing. But the Indians found themselves put out of their own home. Can you imagine? They thought the Dutch just wanted to use the land while they were passing through. So why not share? I mean, who can really own an island? It's like claiming the moon. It's God's property. Truth. The Dutch were a lot more concrete about things, Professor DeFries told her, adjusting her round gold-rimmed glasses. More dollars and cents people. They definitely did some things that were wrong, but a big part of it was a clash of cultures. And we still have a clash of cultures today. We do. And it's sad, but we do. Ma and Professor DeFries seemed very wary of each other, and it made me uneasy. My grandfather couldn't see them, but I imagined that he could feel the heat. Mr. Leveson, who sat between them, seemed on edge too, tapping his cane again and again as if he were trying to slowly punch a hole through the floor. People think every issue is about race, he huffed under his breath. And some people do, but we're not going to go there. Who was right, Grandpa, the Indians or the Dutch? I asked. Depends on who's telling the story, he said, laughing to himself. I'll let you puzzle it out. But it wasn't just race that divided people, son, Grandpa said. It was religion, too. That's true, too. Religion still divides people. I was wondering when you were going to say something about religion and intolerance because there were plenty. What's plenty? Mr. Livingston said, sounding off again. At that, his granddaughter, wedged between him and Ma, began to twirl a lock of her hair instantly. Only Mrs. McLeod, who wore fancy church hats today, being peached with over-the-eye knitting, seemed content. But then anything my grandfather said might move her to a laugh and clap her gloved hands lightly. She preferred the first forward-facing seat just behind me. I knew from the moment I saw her look at my grandfather that she had a crush on him. I was aware that she would come between me and him. Okay, move over, Mrs. McLeod, Grandpa asked. Just fine, Mr. Man, she purred. We rode along for a while with no one saying anything, no one even making eye contact. Boredom ran toward me with open arms. I started to doze off. Got to show you my basement museum one day, Grandpa's voice roused me. I saw him toss back a couple of peanuts. Been meaning to take you, but since your grandma got sick, his voice choked up for a moment and slowly cleared. Though he only lived around the corner from us, I hadn't been to his house in a long, long time. Yep, I got to take you down there. Got a wooden sign, almost 300 years old, for when they spelled Harlem with 2 A's. It used to be nailed to a tree right at the border of Harlem Village, just on the post road. Got some flint arrowheads from the Indians. Even got the free papers of an ex-slave named Mary Gunderson. She carried them everywhere so that people wouldn't try to force her back into her old job. Ain't no fun working for no pay, especially when your boss is an ungrateful so-and-so trying to whip your hind parts all the time. At that, he let out a big, rumbling laugh. I laughed too. So did Mrs. McLeod. Then Rachel, Professor DeFries, and finally Mr. Livingston, Levi's son. It seemed to ease the strain a little bit, at least for the moment. Well, you got your own museum, I said. I wasn't what about museums. Even today, I'll take a live action flick over a dead impersonation painting, but somehow, even at 7 years old, I sensed that there will be something special in Grandpa's museum. A fragment of who he was and maybe who we all were. Whew, how many more pages would you like? Looks like maybe 4 or 6 more pages. Well, your own museum, I said again, wanting him to know I was impressed. He smiled. I smiled too. And to this day, I remember that moment as distant from all the rest. He had a short break before we started back uptown. All the passengers had been delivered to their destinations. So after stopping the bus, Grandpa got up and sat next to me. We ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and drank chocolate milk. Sounds pretty good, don't it? Which my mother had packed for us. Across the way, we watched scores of people boarding the boats bound for the Statue of Liberty. Grandpa pointed over to the other side of the street. He said it used to be Fort Amsterdam, the original Dutch settlement. Inside its walls were governor's mansions, soldiers' barracks, and the first St. Nicholas Church. But all I saw was the block-long building that looked like a bank. So much has changed. Everybody seemed to be in a hurry to make progress. And they're still, that's true to this day. But Grandpa liked the old stuff. He fussed at my parents for selling off their antique furniture, scoffed at food from cans and freezers, preferred his radio to almost anything on TV. His highest phrase was, now that's the real McCoy. Grandpa didn't even want to forget about slavery. He seemed to feel that we would all need to hold on to those memories to remind us how important it was to stay free. If you know all this history, I asked him, why do you drive a bus? I like to think of myself as a roving historian, son. I help people see things they might have missed, he said, wiping a crumb from his lips. Way back when, this job looked pretty good, got me and your grandmother a house, and put 2 girls through college. So you might say I just bloomed where I was planted. But you could write history books, I told him. Suddenly sad, that he spent his days driving around in circles, ones that actually kept people awake. I'm more of a talker than a writer, Grandpa said. Somebody could write all that stuff down for you, I suggested. Grandpa looked at me for a moment. Maybe one day they will, son. Maybe whoever does it will even put in a line or two about your old grandpa. One more question. Shoot, Grandpa said. Why do you call me son when my name is Terrence? I never had a son, he told me. I kind of liked the idea. But can I call you Terrence? No, I said, call me son. At home later that evening, I asked my mother about Grandpa's stories. He used to tell me the same tales he's telling you, she said, as she stirred a frozen brick of spinach into a small saucepan. Too bad I wouldn't sit still long enough to listen. Just then my father walked in, sat down and rested his arms against our white kitchen table with blue trim. He had panda eyebrows that made him look a little tired, and mutton chop sideburns, which he trimmed religiously. I played with my knife and fork as my mother and father lunched in a discussion that floated from civil rights to the Russian strikes in space to whether we could afford a summer vacation. Excuse me, I interrupted, but I have to know, did all that stuff Grandpa talked about really happen? Well, yes, my mother said, sliding on the oven mitt and reaching in for the meatloaf. Then she tilted the pan and the ladle and the ketchup-y sauce over the meat. You think your grandfather would drive around all day inventing a bunch of nonsense? Do yourself a favor and pay attention, she told me. Slide on a plate of food in front of me. He'll give you the skinny you can't find in so-called history books. Your grandpa's really good, my father chimed in. We especially like how he gets out of our hair every Saturday. We especially like how he gets you out of our hair every Saturday, he said, laughing. I knew it from the very beginning. I looked back and forth between my parents. James, my mother fussed at my father, a giggling quiver at the corners of her mouth. Quit hectoring that boy so he can eat. Okay, come back tomorrow for chapter 5. See you then. Bye.